Awesome. First off, thank you all so much for coming to our Tuesday webinar. This is our longer format webinar. We're going to go through what's new in Airflow 2.4. Airflow 2.4 dropped, I think, at the beginning of last week or the week before. Time is all the same to me. So it dropped very recently, and there's a ton of new changes that we're very excited about. A couple of quick logistics notes. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat in the Q&A. We're going to try to get to as many of them during the webinar and then after as well, if there's time. And then additionally, everything will be recorded and the slides and the code will be sent out to you, right? So don't feel the need to just be on the lookout for that follow-up. And last but not least, we'd love to hear your feedback and additional topics you want us to cover. So please feel free to shoot anything in the Q&A and the suggestions, in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll definitely give it a read. With that said, I think, Kenton, I'll hand it off to you to introduce yourself and get us kicked off here. I will go off camera and patrol the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Viraj. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Kenton. I'm a lead developer advocate at Astronomer. And as Viraj said, we're super excited today to talk about what's new in Airflow 2.4. So we do these webinars for every minor or major Airflow release to make sure that the community has a good sense of all of the new great stuff that came out in the new release. So this one was just a couple of weeks ago. So we're already seeing lots of adoption of some of the new features and are super excited to go through them today. So I will go ahead and dive right in. Like I said, we have a lot to cover and I want to make sure that there is time for questions. So we're going to move through stuff pretty quickly. I'm going to assume that most folks here today are already at least a little familiar with Airflow, but in case anybody is newer and also looking to learn what's new in the latest release, just as a very brief overview, Airflow is obviously an open source tool for programmatically authoring, scheduling, and monitoring your data pipelines. Super, super popular, tons of downloads every month. Lots of companies and individuals use Airflow for basically every use case. And some of the benefits of using Airflow include a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today, and the new features kind of fit into almost all of these. So it's very scalable, super extensible. Obviously, your pipelines are written as Python code, which we're going to show a lot of that today. And then Slate Airflow is an open source tool, so it has a really large and vibrant community that is particularly relevant with new releases like this, where lots of different contributors contributions went into making this release possible with lots of cool new features. So one of the great benefits of Airflow. And kind of following on that, big new Airflow releases, or at least minor releases, are very frequent now. So if you're already using Airflow, this is my first of probably many throughout this presentation. Urges for you to upgrade. New Airflow features in these minor releases have been, sort of range from like really good quality of life improvements to pretty game-changing things that actually change what you can do with Airflow. So we have, covered what was new in Airflow 2.2 and 2.3 within the last year. Those included some really cool features like deferrable operators and dynamic task mapping. Airflow 2.4 again was released in September and has one kind of big new feature, and then builds on a lot of the progress that was made in these other releases. So Airflow is, very far from a static project. It's super dynamic. It's changing all of the time. Again, with both, everything from like minor bug fixes to these big new features that you'll definitely want to take advantage of. So definitely upgrade as soon as you can. So with that, we'll jump right into what's new in 2.4. So I've already said this a couple times now, but there was one major new feature that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. There were also over 40 what I would call significant updates. So these are things that regular Airflow users would probably notice. So again, everything from kind of quality of life improvements to expansion on other features that were released in other Airflow versions to new operators and things like that. So we're going to cover some of those in depth today, and then kind of give you some resources to learn about the others that we don't get a chance to actually demo. All of this came from over 650 user-facing commits. So again, lots of folks working on the Airflow project, and they're doing really great work and they're moving really fast with it. So this was a lot of work went into 2.4 over the last couple of months, and we're really excited to share that with the community. So with that, I'm going to dive right into the major new features. So these are ones that are kind of bigger, a little more game changing, so to speak. They might, be kind of new use cases that, or they might be relevant for new use cases that you weren't using Airflow for previously. These are features that we're actually going to demo. So again, I'll spend a little bit more time going in depth on them. And the first one that I referenced as that one kind of major new feature. So this was net new. This does not exist in Airflow prior to 2.4, is datasets and data-aware scheduling. So you'll hear sort of both terms used sometimes interchangeably throughout. They're kind of all part of the same feature. We'll talk about what these are. But basically, this means that DAGs that access the same data sets are going to have explicit visible relationships, and they can be scheduled based on updates to those data sets. So you could think about prior to Airflow 2.4, if you needed to have dependencies in your DAGs sort of based on data, there were kind of two ways of doing that. One was, putting all of your tasks in a single DAG. One was, making cross DAG dependencies, and there were multiple methods for doing so. Datasets is going to provide a smarter way of doing that. So this is going to be helpful for use cases like you can imagine if a data analytics team builds reports that are refreshed daily, but they want to ensure they're only working on the most up-to-date data. So if another DAG is actually producing that data, say you want to run, all of your jobs only when those DAGs have completed, you can use datasets for that. Another one that I have kind of a demo DAG of today is a data science team wants to train and publish a model, but obviously only after the relevant training data has actually been updated. So, and this is a way of making your DAGs more event driven and have more visible relationships between them. So benefits of implementing datasets and data-aware scheduling include things like you're going to be able to create smaller DAGs instead of monolithic ones. So it's a way of implementing dependencies between your DAGs such that you can keep them separate rather than having them all as one. This is super helpful in cases where you might have different teams that are working on different data sets that are dependent, and putting all of those tasks in one DAG is sort of ungainly in terms of how you're working on it. It also just allows you to, make things more manageable, keep your pipeline slightly more atomic. It's generally a best practice that we recommend in terms of tasks. Having smaller pipelines just makes things more manageable, especially in the case of failures where you have to rerun parts of your pipeline. That's all going to be easier if you don't have to cram everything in one DAG just to get the dependencies in there. Kind of related to that, I've already mentioned, this is going to allow each team to maintain their own DAGs, even if data is shared across them. In some use cases, this datasets can replace the external task sensor or the trigger DAG run operator. If you're not familiar with these are methods that you could use to implement cross DAG dependencies prior to Airflow 2.4. Those two options they're still going to be relevant in some cases and they work just fine. But in the case of data sets, you will save resources because, as we'll show, you won't have like a sensor that's sitting there running, waiting for something to happen. It makes the scheduling a little bit easier, and it's going to be a lot more visible in the UI. So if you are in one of these use cases that we'll talk about, data sets are going to be probably preferable to those two options. And finally, I'll say this yet again, but we're going to see it in just a minute. You'll have increased visibility into those DAG dependencies. So datasets are super simple to implement in your DAGs. I won't go through this in too much detail because I'm just going to show it in a minute. But basically what you're going to do is use this new dataset class. You're going to instantiate that in your DAG. You'll use a URI to define to identify your dataset. You're then going to indicate a producer task. So with datasets, kind of this new terminology where we refer to a task that updates the dataset as a producer task. You as the DAG author are responsible for telling Airflow what the producer tasks are. So you do this by defining an outlet parameter. The other kind of new terminology is the consumer DAG. So this is the downstream quote DAG that is going to be scheduled based on when those data sets update. So that's going to listen to those producer tasks and it'll run when they're completed. So in that one, you're also going to provide the data set and you're going to provide it to the schedule parameter in the DAG. So simple to implement. I'm going to move from here over and to my Airflow instance that I have running and go ahead and show this feature. It's a little easier to see. So for data sets, note, I'm just running Airflow here on my local computer. I'm using the Astro CLI, which is why you'll actually notice. So I'm running 600, runtime 600, which is Airflow 240. There's already been a couple of updates to fix little things here or there. So that's why it's telling me to upgrade. But this is a great option using the Astro CLI if you want to get started and try out Airflow 2.4. It will pull a 2.4 version by default. So we'll provide the link for how to get started with that. So once I'm here, I have a couple of DAGs that I'm going to talk about to show data sets. And the first thing I want to note before I hop into them, so we're going to look at this data set upstream 1, data set upstream 2, and this data set downstream 1, 2. So 3 DAGs here. One thing you'll notice right away with this data set downstream, this is the one that we're going to schedule on a data set, is that here in my schedule column, you'll notice it says data set. So these other ones are going to say none if they don't have a schedule, or if they have a regular cron schedule. These ones are daily. This one says data set, which means this DAG is going to run when data is updated. You'll also notice the next run column. It doesn't have a time here because it's not a time-based schedule. We're scheduling when certain data sets are updated, and it's going to tell me which ones haven't been run yet. So right now, this is requiring 2 data sets. Neither of them have been updated. So we'll go ahead and look at this DAG and just look at the code for it. This DAG doesn't actually do anything, so we're just using it to highlight the how you implement this data set feature. So again, this is the consumer DAG. So this is how we actually schedule based on a data set. So let's say this DAG does something and we have these 2 S3 data sets and we don't want this DAG to run until both of them have been updated. So again, I'm going to import this new dataset class. It's just from Airflow. I do that here. I then define my data sets that I want it to listen for. Again, they're both defined using URIs. You can see I have this output 1 and output 2. These have S3 URIs. An important thing to note about data sets right now is that the URI doesn't actually matter. So that's the format that it's using. Airflow is not actually aware of what this data is. It's not connecting to an external system. To listen, you could put ABC, XYZ in here. That would also be totally valid. So this is just a way of identifying the data sets. The Airflow team will be building on this in future releases, so that's why it's defined as the URI. But for now, it is sort of helpful to define them as you would a regular URI and have the actual path to that data if you're paying attention to that. So this is saying I need both of these data sets to be updated, and then I simply provide them to the schedule parameter. One thing that I'm going to talk about later, but I guess I'll mention it now, is the schedule param has changed. So it's now schedule, not schedule interval. But so I provide both of those data sets here. I go back to DAGs view. So that's how I define the consumer DAG. So it's super easy. Now I have to define the producer task. So which DAGs actually update those data sets that need to run first before this can run. So one of those I do in this data set upstream 1. So we'll take a look at the code for this. This DAG also doesn't do anything, but you can see again, I'm going to import this data set data set class. and define my URI. So note, this is the same URI as I had in the consumer DAG. So they do have to match. Otherwise, Airflow is just reading these as strings. So if they don't match, you're not going to be connecting those. And then in any tasks that update this data set, I am going to provide this as the outlets parameter. So I do that here. Let's in this bash operator. This is telling Airflow that this is a producer task. So this task updates this data set. You'll note that this is actually just a bash operator that sleeps for 5 seconds. It doesn't actually do anything in S3. So again, at this stage, it is on you as the DAG author to determine what tasks actually update the data sets and how you want Airflow to wait and schedule. So you have to come in here and figure out what should be, where this outlet should be defined. It doesn't actually have to update the data set. I mean, in a real case, you would want it to, but in this case, I don't have that implemented. So same thing here in dataset upstream 2. So if I look at the code for this one, we have my second dataset defined here. Again, same URI is used in my consumer DAG. And in this case, you'll notice I have it provided as an outlet to both of these tasks, task 1 and task 2. So the first one sleeps for 5 seconds, the second one sleeps for 30 seconds. And both of these are producer tasks for this. So now if I go back, let's go ahead and trigger the first one of these upstream DAGs. So this is going to run. Another feature I'll point out here while I'm on here is there's a new auto refresh on the DAGs view. Super great quality of life improvement. It's really nice. Okay, so that one ran. So now if I refresh this, sometimes I have to actually refresh. You'll see this next run on my downstream DAG updated to one of 2 data sets updated. So they shouldn't both be in the pending tooltip there, but it does correctly identify that, okay, one of them has been updated. Now we're going to go ahead and trigger second DAG. This one's going to take a few seconds, but in a minute, we should see this downstream DAG start to run. So there, you see it's running now. So this, my other producer task ran for my second data set. And since that had been updated, this DAG went ahead and ran. One thing you might notice is that this DAG is actually still running, this upstream 2, because that second task I had sleeps for 30 seconds. So it takes a little while. But my downstream DAG, my consumer DAG has already run, even though both of these tasks have DAG2 dataset as an outlet. So they're both producer tasks. That's because with data sets, so in order to trigger the consumer DAG to say, okay, this data set has been updated, it's going to do that on the first update of a data set. So if you have 10 tasks that update that are producer tasks for the same data set, so they update data set A, as soon as the first one has completed, any consumer DAGs will go ahead and say, okay, it's time for me to run. So even though this one had another run of that, or another task that produced that data set, after the first one completed, we went ahead and triggered this one. So you do have to be kind of careful there with how you implement this based on the behavior that you want. So something to note there. Just as a slightly more real world example, to show you how this could work, it's not going to look any different, but we have a couple of other DAGs here that are sort of highlighting that ML example that I brought up earlier. So if I look at the publish one, this DAG uploads data to S3. So I have a Python task does that here. So again, I'm saying this is my producer DAG or my producer task. So I define my data set here and the outlets to this task. This is how you do it if you're using a decorator. You just provide outlets right there. I have the data set URI defined here. And then in my consumer DAG, this is the one that actually trains the model. So this DAG is a little longer. It goes through and trains a SageMaker model and then publishes the results to Redshift. But you can see I'm scheduling it on my dataset URI, which is up here, and it's the same based on this S3 key. So a little more of a real world example of when you might actually want to do this not in bash operators. Again, the implementation is super straightforward. There's not a lot of code that you have to add or change. And one of the really nice things about datasets is, again, I mentioned before that you have increased visibility. So we already kind of touched on some of the great things in this view where you can see, what has been updated and that it's waiting on a data set. There's also this new datasets view, which is going to show you all of the datasets that exist in your Airflow environment, as well as a graph kind of showing how they all go together. So the one we just looked at is here at the top. So this is the this one. So we can see I have a DAG that publishes and then goes to this data set, and then another DAG that consumes it. So this is just kind of a nice visual way of seeing all of the dependencies that you have in your environment. If you are already implementing cross-DAG dependencies in another way, you might be familiar with the DAG dependencies view under the Browse tab here. This will also show you any dependencies that you have implemented with external task sensor or trigger run operator, but it now also shows data sets. So those are the ones in orange. And you can see kind of the whole layout here with the DAGs and the data sets and how they're updated. So here's my the example I showed earlier, where I have two data sets that feed into this dataset downstream 1.2 DAG. And then this one actually also produces another data set that I defined in the DAG. Super cool new feature. This is really powerful. It also kind of lays the stage for future Airflow improvement. So definitely keep an eye out for when we do these in the future on new minor releases. So this is kind of phase one of Airflow's data awareness implementation. So there will be more functionality coming. But for right now, it's a really nifty way, again, to implement cross-DAG dependencies and make everything a little more modular, make your DAGs smaller. Cool. So from there, I'm going to hop back into my slides here and talk about the next kind of bigger feature that we're going to talk about in a little bit of depth. And that's updates to dynamic task mapping. So dynamic task mapping was a feature that was added in 2.3. This one was sort of truly game changing in terms of what you could do with Airflow. It allows you to dynamically create tasks at runtime rather than at parse time in your DAG. So your DAG can change based on conditions every time it runs. So 2.3 was the initial implementation of this feature. 2.4 brought some improvements to it, or I should say expansion maybe on it. Expansion is maybe a poor choice of words given the terminology used here, but there's more that you can do now with it in 2.4. So one of the big updates was within 2.3, you could map over multiple parameters using expand, and also I guess pause here for a moment and say, if you're not familiar with dynamic task mapping, you can go back and watch our What's New in 2.3 webinar that we did back in the spring. We're also having another webinar in 2 weeks that's going to talk about this feature in particular in depth. So I'm going to give kind of a highlight today. But if you're not familiar with any of these things I'm saying, you don't know what the expand function is, don't worry, we'll show an example, but we'll also talk about it more in depth. In any case, if you used expand over multiple parameters within 2.3, you could do that, but it always resulted in a cross product, which is not necessarily what you want in every case of mapping over multiple parameters. So now with 2.4, there are several different options that are supported. One, you can always do the original 2.3 implementation is also still possible. So if you do expand over a couple of keyword arguments, that's going to result in a cross product. There's also a new function called zip. This is actually not a new function per se, it's a Python function, but implementation within Airflow is new in 2.4. This allows you to implement zip-like behavior for multiple positional arguments. So we'll talk about this more in a minute, but that's mostly relevant to Python functions. And there's also a new expand quargs function, which is going to let you map over sets of keyword arguments. So that's for any operator. So we'll show that in just a second. The other big new dynamic task mapping feature is called the map function. So this is actually super handy. I'm really excited about this one. This allows you to transform the parameters that you're mapping over. So this is useful particularly if you're mapping over the results of a previous task, but that operator doesn't return results in the format that you're looking for. So we'll show an example of this, but you often before had to sort of manually finagle things into the format that you were looking for. Now you can just use this map function. So we're going to demo some of these as well. So I'm going to hop back into Airflow. Again, I'll note I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, and dynamic task mapping is a big topic, and even these new features are I should say easy to implement, not necessarily super easy to wrap your head around at first, just the mathematical concepts going on, at least for me. So no worries if you're a little unsure. Again, we will be sending out the repo afterwards so you can play around with these examples. And our next webinar in 2 weeks is going to cover all of this in a lot more depth with more examples. So first, we are going to look at this example, which has a whole bunch of tasks that are in parallel that are implementing mapping kind of in different ways. So this is a great place to look just to see in general how it's working. It's just a toy example, so it's not actually doing anything, but it does give you a sense of, kind of what's going on. So the first one that we'll talk about is the expand quargs option, or actually I should say the first example I'm going to use shows how it was done before, so you can get a sense of what is changing. That's this example one here. So this first bash operator. So what we're doing here is expanding over two different parameters. So we have our partial, the task ID stays the same. The expand, so this is the classical quote way as of 2.3. I provide 3 different bash commands. So one is going to print the environment variable. One is going to print the number of letters in what I pass in, and then the other is going to replace each E with an X. And then I also map over this env. And I provide 3 options here. So this is the classical one, which means we're going to get a cross product. So that means I'm going to get 9 different mapped tasks. So basically every combination of these 3 and these 3. If I go back to the graph view here, you'll see in this cross product example, I've got 9 mapped task instances. Instead, if you don't want to do a cross product, you can use that new expand quargs function. Again, this is relevant for keyword args. So any operator that you're going to use where you want to map over multiple parameters. In this case, we have a function that again takes my 3 combinations, turns them into an XCOM arg here, and then we pass that in using this expand quargs function. So in this case, we still have the same 3 bash commands: echo whirl, echo the word variable, print the length, replace E's with X's, and then our words. But you can see in this case, we're providing them sort of in pairs. So similar to what you might think of as like a zip function. But as the user, you can define sort of the pairs that you want to map over for any given operator. So this one is going to result in just 3 mapped task instances. So if we look at this one, that is our graph. That's going to be these two. So turn into xcomarg and then expand quargs, xcomarg. You can see we have 3 different ones. If we look at the logs for one of them, just for fun, you can see our output here is just hello. So it just printed the word. If we, let's look at this one so I can actually look at the logs in here. This was another great update I'm going to highlight. You can now see the logs in the grid view. This will also update in real time as your task is running. So super exciting to me, at least. You don't have to click into the log view every time. So remember, our second command was expressing the length of the word. So that's 3. We look at oops, I want the, sorry. Go back here. Mapped tasks, here we go. And we look at the second one. We replaced all E's with X's. So instead of doing that cross product, you just have basically whatever you define as the input for multiple parameters. So super useful there if you need to map over more than one thing. The last update that I'll kind of show here is the zip. So zip is another way to map over multiple parameters without without getting a cross product. But it's only relevant for positional arguments, not for multiple keyword arguments. So basically what that means is if you have like a Python function that has multiple positional arguments that you're going to provide. So in this case, we have a function that adds X, Y, and Z. You can use zip for something like this. Most other operators, it's not going to be relevant for because somebody surprised me, but to my knowledge, there aren't operators with built-in parameters that are like tuples or take positional arguments. It might also be relevant if you have made your own custom hooks or operators and are doing things like this, but I'd imagine that Python functions are the most relevant here. So in this case, you have, you're going to pass in a list of zipped arguments. So we do that with a function here. So we're going to add these numbers and we're going to return a zipped list. So you can see here we use, here's where we're calling this task flow add numbers function and expanding over the zipped arguments. And then, sorry, I'm showing 2 different things, 2 different things at once. This is how you do it with a decorator for the Python function. So you just call that function and then the arguments, you can also do it with a traditional Python operator, which is what this one is doing. So here we call the Python operator and expand over those zipped arguments. And that's just using, again, that Python zip function. So zip is a little tricky. It's works kind of how you think it would, where it's going to pair, you know, the items in a couple of lists, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. There is specific behavior that occurs if you have lists of different lengths and things like that. We have, I'll get to an additional resources slide that has our guide that goes through all of this. So we'll talk about that in depth there and more in our next webinar as a resource. But again, just wanted to go through that quickly so that you know it's out there and there are additional resources for implementing in more detail. And then the last one I'll show really quickly here is that map function. So again, this is going to be for if you need to transform the parameters that you're mapping over. So if they come from an upstream task, basically you can define your own function that does whatever you want it to do. This might be relevant if your, say, operator returns like a list of things, but you need them to be strings. Or I've also seen some operators, like say the S3 to Snowflake operator, expects a list of whatever it is. So if you're taking that result from like an S3 operator, you would have to turn your list into a list of lists. Anything like that, map can take care of. So what you're going to do here is just define a function that does whatever you want it to do to your list. It's going to operate on each entry in your list of parameters that you're going to map over. And it's going to do that as part of the downstream task. So this is not going to create another task in your DAG. And again, you can define that function however you want. So in this particular case, what we're doing is our upstream function returns a list of strings. Here they are. There's 5 things here. We're going to say anything that has the word skip in it. We don't actually want that task to run as part of the mapping. So we define this function that determines whether or not the string contains the word skip. It also adds an exclamation point to some of them, which is we're going to emphatically say hi instead of just say hi. And then we can say, okay, if anything contains the word skip, go ahead and raise this Airflow skip exception, which is just going to tell Airflow, hey, skip that task. Otherwise, we don't do anything. Then when we go ahead and call these functions, our downstream function is just going to print the results. And we say, sorry, I always skip this line. Here's where we call the upstream function, which is where we apply that map. So we list our strings and then we say, apply this map to the results and pass in our mapping function. And then with our downstream function, we just do this like we normally would. So we expand over the upstream. What this looks like in practice then, so I just ran this one. So if we look at my map function, I have 5 tasks here, but 2 of them were skipped. So those are the ones that said skip at the beginning. So again, this one, you can do whatever you want with. There's no requirements for what you put in that Python function. It just gives you the option. So great kind of expansion on the dynamic task mapping functionality there. Cool. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about a couple of other new features that, again, we just want to make sure everybody is aware of. We're not going to demo them in depth, but they're cool little improvements that, again, are another reason to upgrade. One, you heard me touch on this earlier, is the new schedule parameter. So as prior to Airflow 2.4, you had schedule interval and timetable as of Airflow 2.2, where depending on how you were scheduling your DAG, you had to provide one or the other of those parameters. Those have now been consolidated. So there's just one schedule parameter. It is schedule. You can provide it with like a classic schedule, so a cron expression, one of those presets like @daily. If you're using a timetable, you can provide that timetable, or like I showed here, if you're using datasets, you can provide that. So you no longer need to worry about sort of which type of schedule you're using. It's all just one schedule parameter. This is because this is a minor release, there aren't any breaking changes. So if you still use schedule interval, that will work. You'll just see a warning about those being deprecated. So again, this will require a very tiny change eventually in some of your existing DAGs, but it will make it much more straightforward going forward. Couple of new operators and decorators that we're excited about. There is a new external Python operator and its equivalent decorator. So that's @task external Python. That allows you to run a Python function in an existing virtual environment. So you might be familiar with the Python virtual env operator. That's going to create a new virtual env. This is going to, again, run in an existing one. So that's great for some use cases. There's also a new Kubernetes task flow decorator. So this is the Kubernetes pod operator, but in in decorator notation. So that's super nice if you prefer that style of DAG authoring. Note here that this does require the new version of the Kubernetes provider, which I believe is 4.4. So you'll have to upgrade that as well. And there's also a new short circuit task flow decorator. So again, adding on to the decorators, a lot of folks prefer that style of DAG authoring. It's much more straightforward. It's a little easier to read. So we're familiar with Python, find it more intuitive. So kind of adding on to what's possible there. So if you're working mostly with Python tasks and you're short circuiting, you can now just add the decorator. Well, next update is auto-registering DAGs used in a context manager or defined with a decorator do not, well, I should say, are now auto-registered, which means they do not need to be assigned to a module variable. This is a small update, but it did catch people up sometimes, and it's just a little bit less code you have to write, which is always nice. So prior to this, you would do something like in a context manager, with DAG as DAG. You now don't need this as DAG part. Or if you're using a decorator where you have to say DAG equals example DAG, you don't have to do that now. It's just call the function. Yeah, again, just a little quality of life improvement there. If you've ever not had your DAG show up because you forgot this as DAG part, you don't have to worry about anymore. I will also note that you can turn this behavior off if for some reason you want that module variable assignment. A couple of other great updates. Some of these I've already shown. So auto refresh for the DAGs view. Absolutely love this. It's super nice. Auto refresh was one of the coming for other views has been a great quality of life improvement. It's one I personally have been super excited about, not to have to sit and hit the refresh button all the time. So now another view and having that on the home screen where you can see everything is very nice. Note that experimental smart sensors have been removed. So if you are using smart sensors, this is a great time to move over to deferrable operators, which are the alternative moving forward. Another note on things moving around. So the DB API hook and SQL sensor are now part of the common SQL provider. This is probably only relevant for folks who have, custom hooks or operators built off of these things. Well, I should say that's for the hook. If you're using the SQL sensor, you will now have to install this provider, but that will be hopefully come with sort of improved updates to those packages over time, now that they're part of that provider. There's a new roles delete command in the CLI. So if you are managing Airflow users programmatically, that's just another nice command that allows you to delete roles. Won't be super relevant for astronomer customers, or if you have some sort of other RBAC system in place. But if you're managing that more manually, that might be helpful. And there is support for task groups now in the external task sensor. So if you, instead of wanting to wait for a particular task to be done, you want to wait for a task group to be done, you can now do that. So again, might be nice for some use cases. This is only a sampling of the things. So notice I said earlier that there were more than 40 big updates. I obviously haven't covered 40 today, but we're already almost out of time. So I did link to the release notes here if you want to check out all of the other great stuff. Again, we're sending these slides out, so that's why I included some links in here for where you can go to learn more about any of these things. I'm going to plug for probably the 50th time our upcoming webinars that are going to dive into some of the dynamic task mapping stuff in more detail. But there are also kind of other things talking about, more from a more inspirational sense when you would want to use data sets, as well as guides that go into those things more in depth. So definitely check those out if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I will save at least a couple of minutes for any questions.
Awesome. feels like there was just as much progress made on dynamic task mapping as there was on new scheduling paradigms. Super exciting.
Definitely.
I think I got to most of the questions, Kenton, but there are a couple it would be better for you to uh, oh, of course I sneeze as soon as I as soon as I have to talk, right? That's just the way it works. Cool. So could you just go over again the piece about the scheduling parameters? Madison is asking, will models.dag eventually get a schedule parameter? She tried doing a find and replace for schedule interval and schedule, but there were some code references that kind of broke. So is it eventually going to be consolidated?
So are you asking like how you import them? I mean, it's still, yeah, let me pull up the you don't have to import the schedule interval, so I would think that you should be able to do a find replace.
Sorry, in the core DAG class object.
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't know actually off the top of my head how they're implementing that under the hood. So if you're modifying that, then I would proceed with caution for now is my advice. Because obviously, again, since this wasn't a breaking change, the old parameters will still work. And yeah, I don't know how that's a little beyond my level, how like things that are deprecated but not yet removed actually work. So there will still be references to them.
Yeah, we can, if you follow up with us, Madison, we can get you a better answer.
Yeah.
So Justin is asking, if you have a DAG that is subscribed to multiple data sets, will that DAG run if any of those data sets are updated? If all of them, how does that work?
Yeah, it's if all of them. So right now, the only option is if you provide multiple, like in this particular case, all of them have to be updated. So I think that an update to have like any or something like that will potentially be in a future Airflow release. But for right now, you can treat this as an all. It's just that note that it's the first time. So the first time this one, and then the first time this one is the first time both of them are updated. If that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. Another question would be around the task flow API and some other of the operators. So can you use the task flow API with any of the operators out there, or do you have to, does there have to be a decorator for that operator? Suppose if you want to do something like BigQuery.
Yeah, that's a great question. There has to be a decorator. So you can't just do at task dot whatever operator you want. There has to be an existing decorator for it. I will note that you can always create your own. And I would encourage anybody doing that to contribute them back to the Airflow project. New decorators are added definitely in every minor Airflow release. So they are increasing, but it's still a relatively limited bunch, mostly around kind of Python related operators right now.
I'm going to shamelessly plug Astro SDK here, as if you're looking for a decorated approach to writing BigQuery DAGs, Astro SDK, which is an open source library that should work on any instance of Airflow post 2.0, could be the way to go. And it's completely open source, so we'd encourage you to check it out. Yeah. Cool. Let's see here. So another question, and this is like I think it's hard to answer now, but I think future it's going to go that way, is from Sibi. I hope I pronounced that right. Is the dataset really doing the same thing as a sensor right now? Is the dataset eventually going to get rid of sensors? Like, talk about datasets and sensors.
Yeah, great question. So they are kind of like a sensor in that they are listening for another task to have completed. So right now they're not they're not a replacement for every sensor because, well, or I should say it's very dependent on your use case. So if you are using a sensor that is waiting for something to happen and that thing that happens is done by another DAG in that same airflow environment, then you could use datasets instead. Obviously, there are other use cases for sensors where that's not what's happening. And in that case, datasets are not going to be a replacement. So they're not a one-to-one. There's a lot of overlap there. In sort of a future iteration, you can expect that data aware piece to sort of grow. So right now, data sets are just kind of a built-in sensor, and they're easier to use and you have more visibility over them, but they won't stay that way. This is again kind of phase 1 quote of the implementation. So you'll have much more capability over time with that data sets feature than you would with just a sensor. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah.
And I would say that for now, if you are in a use case where you could use a sensor or a data set, I would use the data set because it's going to be better for resource consumption. And again, kind of more easier to see the visibilities and things like that.
Yeah, so by no means is a replacement right now, especially in its current state. And we definitely don't want to deprecate sensors at all, right? It's more about giving you a more data-centric interface to do this sorts of things while still also maintaining sensors and so on. So like data sets as of right now don't have something like soft fail or any of those other things. It's just another option for you to use.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think those were all the questions that we have time for. So like we said, this is a really, really complex topic, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming in the future. So please feel free to reach out to us about any of it. Be on the lookout for our next webinar. That'll really be a deeper dive on that dynamic task mapping. And yeah, like we said, all of the recordings and the code should be sent over to your email in the next couple of days. So just be on the lookout for that as well. But thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate all the questions and the feedback, and look forward to you all using 2.4. It'll be great.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.